Handcuffs snapped shut around Lieutenant Naomi Carter's wrists as two racist cops dragged her away inside the courtroom in full uniform before the judge could even speak. The place meant for justice had turned into a stage for humiliation. Yet with one quiet move, Naomi made a call that would shake their world to pieces. How could a single act inside court flip the power against those who abused it? If this injustice makes you stop and think, hit like and share, because the truth behind that call will leave you stunned. Let's begin. I was sitting 3 rows back on the left, close enough to smell the old wood and hear the scuff of shoes on the tile when the afternoon crowd pressed into Charleston's courthouse. Voices curled into the rafters, lawyers whispering deals, families clutching folders, a clerk calling out names that sounded like warnings. The air had that stiff official quiet, the kind that tells you truth is about to be measured, weighed and stamped. That's when she stepped in. Lieutenant Naomi Carter. Navy blue service uniform pressed sharp metals, catching the brittle light like small, stubborn stars. She didn't carry herself like someone who wanted to be seen. She carried herself like someone who refused to disappear. A deputy directed her toward the witness benches, and she gave a polite nod, one hand resting on a folder, the other free, relaxed, ready. You could tell she'd been trained to make every movement count. 2 court security officers tracked her from the moment she crossed the threshold. Sergeant Blake Reynolds was the kind of man you notice even when you don't want a square jaw set hard, shoulders pitched forward like he was already bracing for a fight. His partner officer Mark Cooper stood half a pace behind younger, careful eyes, never settling anywhere for long. They wore the same uniform, but it fit them differently. On Reynolds, it was armor. On Cooper, it felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Naomi took her seat at the witness rail. The room shifted to accommodate her the way a crowd shifts when a storm cloud rolls in. No panic, just the hush that comes right before the first drop. A woman in front of me leaned toward her husband. She's military. She breathed as if saying it quietly might keep it safer. The husband only nodded, mouth tight. Even the bailiff glanced twice, then pretended he hadn't. I heard Reynolds before I saw him move. Low voice sharpened on purpose. Uniform doesn't make you noble in here. He said it like he was trimming a wick, small words meant to control how the flame would burn. Naomi lifted her eyes steady and unbothered, then let them drop back to the folder in her lap. She didn't answer. Sometimes silence is a better witness than speech. The judge hadn't entered yet. Lawyers shuffled binders. A court reporter tested her keys. The clock above the seal ticked in a way I could feel at the back of my teeth. The case on the docket was civil. Nothing flashy, at least on paper. Property lines, damaged reputations, money that changed hands and then changed its mind. Naomi was here because facts needed a spine, and she had one. Reynolds drifted along the rail like a tide that wouldn't recede. He wasn't touching anything. He didn't need to. His presence did the touching for him. Cooper hovered near the aisle, watching the door, watching the judge's bench, watching Naomi like he was trying to memorize an exit he might need in a hurry. He cleared his throat, once soft, then stopped himself as if sound alone could be an admission. "Ma'am," Reynolds said, finally planting himself so his shadow cut across Naomi's knees. "Let me see your identification." He said ma'am the way some men say girl. Naomi didn't fumble. She didn't explain herself. She held his gaze for a fraction longer than was comfortable, then set the folder aside and pulled out her wallet. Military ID, driver's license. She arranged them neatly on the rail as if this were routine, as if routine could protect you. "I'm a scheduled witness," she said. Her voice had depth to it, not loud, just full. "The clerk has my paperwork." Reynolds didn't look at the clerk. He leaned in close enough that I could see the corners of his mouth pull not quite a smile. "Paperwork has a way of getting lost," he said. "Step out." The bailiff stirred. "Sergeant," he warned, not unkindly. "Court has a choreography. The bailiff knows the steps." Reynolds cut him a glance that said he'd learned a different dance. Cooper shifted his weight like his shoes hurt. He looked at Naomi's ID and then away, as if that single glance was an intimacy he hadn't meant to share. "She's listed Blake," he said low, almost hopeful. "It's on the sheet." Reynolds didn't turn. "Security doesn't check sheets," he said. "Security checks threats." He let the word hang there, heavy as a gavel. Naomi breathed in slow and visible, the way you do when oxygen has to be an act of will. No tremor in her hands, no apology. She gathered her cards and returned them to the wallet and placed both palms flat on the rail. Sergeant, she said, I'll answer any questions the court has for me. I'm here to testify. That's all. Everything's all until it isn't. Reynolds said. He took one step closer. The space between them vanished like a trap door. That was the moment the room changed. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small, collective awareness that something was veering off the approved map. A clerk's pen stopped scratching. A juror from a previous case peered back through the doorway, sensing weather. Even the lights felt brighter, like the building itself wanted a better look at what it was about to hold. I caught Cooper's face, then really saw it. The uncertainty wasn't just professional, it was personal, like he was standing on a plank and could hear it creak. He touched the radio on his shoulder and then took his hand away. He looked at Naomi, and I swear to you, in that split second, he looked like a kid who'd been told to be a man without being told how. The judge's door remained closed. That door might as well have been another continent. Let me be plain, Reynolds said, straightening, as if he were about to recite an oath only he recognized. In this room, your uniform is a costume. In this room, you follow my direction or you leave in cuffs. No one gasped. That would have made it easier. Instead, people looked down. Papers rustled. The court reporter folded her hands so tightly her knuckles blanched. A man near the back took off his hat, then remembered where he was and put it back on. It is a peculiar cruelty, the quiet kind, the kind that asks a room to collaborate. Naomi didn't look at the door. She didn't scan for help. She set her shoulders the way a person sets a picture frame that's been knocked crooked. I'm here to tell the truth, she said. That's the only direction I'm going to follow. I felt it then, that thin wire running through the room, humming. It stretched from Reynolds' jaw to Cooper's uneasy stance to the clerk's stilled pen and all the way to Naomi's hands on that scarred wooden rail. It's a wire you hear right before something breaks. Reynolds' chin lifted a fraction decision, settling into place. Cooper opened his mouth and closed it again, a fish on dry land, wishing for a tide. Somewhere in the building, a copier started up and then jammed a stutter of plastic teeth, ridiculous, human, ordinary. The kind of sound the world makes while it decides whether to look away. The judge's door stayed shut. Reynolds stepped forward. Naomi did not step back. That's how it began. Not with a shout, not with a siren, with a stare that refused to bow a line drawn on worn wood and a room full of people pretending they couldn't see the edge they were standing on. I remember the exact scrape of Reynolds' boot against the marble when he came back to the rail, like he wanted the sound to announce him. He planted himself so close, his shadow fell over Lieutenant Naomi Carter's hands. Identification, he said, for verification. He made verification sound like a verdict. Naomi didn't blink. I'm a scheduled witness, she replied, even steady. My documents are already filed with the court. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She just placed the words where they belonged on the record. Reynolds didn't take the hint. He tipped his chin at Cooper without looking away from Naomi. Cooper moved because that's what you do when the person in front of you never doubts himself. He reached for the folder on the rail like it might bite. Naomi slid it an inch back toward her side. Not a challenge, a boundary. The judge's door opened at last. Robe glass is the small gravity that comes with a lifetime of rules. She took her seat, and the room did the thing rooms do when judges sit. It remembered what it's for. The bam of the gavel cut a clean line through the air. Counsel, the judge began, then spotted what everyone else had been watching. Sergeant, that witness is here at the court's request. Leave her be. It should have ended there. It could have. The bailiff took a step forward, relieved like he'd been waiting to exhale. A clerk went back to writing the scratch of her pen, a hopeful sound. Reynolds didn't move. He pivoted not to address the bench, but to address the room as if it needed a different kind of reminder. The muscles in his jaw worked once. This is a security matter, he said, each word clipped, controlled. It falls outside your authority, outside your authority. The phrase didn't echo so much as it erased. It erased the bench. It erased the oath. It erased the ground rules we all thought we were standing on. You could feel the oxygen fold in on itself. People stopped shifting. The clerk's pen froze mid-stroke. Somewhere a phone vibrated, and no one dared to silence it. The judge leaned forward. Sergeant, you are out of line. Reynolds didn't break eye contact with Naomi. Ma'am, he answered, but it wasn't an answer. He turned his hand palm down the way you do when you are about to press and want the person to understand you mean to flatten the moment. Cooper whispered, barely sound. Blake, it wasn't a warning, it was a plea. He looked smaller than he had a minute ago, like the uniform had grown 2 sizes while he wasn't watching. Naomi set her feet, not wide, not braced, rooted. I am here to testify, she said. That's the scope of my presence. Reynolds stepped into her space. Step out from the rail. I will comply with lawful orders, Naomi said. He smiled without softness. Good, he said, like he'd been waiting for her to say the word comply. Then comply. He reached. It was efficient, or more than rough at first hand, to risk the practiced pivot that turns a person 90 degrees before they've decided to turn on their own. Naomi didn't resist. She repositioned, and for a heartbeat, I thought maybe the worst would be a bad memory we told ourselves we'd misunderstood. Then he drove her forearms to the lip of the witness table and pinned them there. The edge caught her temple. There was that small, unmistakable sound a body makes when it meets wood at speed. Not a crack. A thud that traveled through the grain and into your bones. Blood found its way fast, a bright thread along her hairline, then a dot on the polished surface, then a drop on the floor. It was ordinary and awful, the way all blood is proof you can't argue with. The judge's gavel slammed again. Sergeant Reynolds, he didn't look up. Stop resisting, he barked, the script already in his mouth. The kind of sentence that tries to manufacture a past tense while it's still happening. Naomi's voice came out low. I am not resisting. No tremor, no wobble, just the fact of it placed carefully on top of his accusation like a weight. The gallery went silent in a way I've never heard a room go silent. Not respectful, not reverent, arrested. People held their breath because breathing felt like participation. Cuffs, Reynolds said to Cooper, and that one word landed like a stone in a well. Cooper flinched. His eyes went to the judge, then to the bailiff, then to Naomi. Sergeant, the court, he tried. Reynolds snapped, now. You could see Cooper's choice happen on his face. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't noble. It was tired and scared and automatic. He took the cuffs from his belt. For a second, his hands hovered over Naomi's wrists like he was blessing her. Then the metal met skin. The click carried bright and final. The judge rose. This is contempt, Sergeant. Stand down. Reynolds lifted his head at last, but not to her. He looked out at us as if to confirm that we were watching, because watchers become witnesses and witnesses become liabilities. Then he returned his attention to the woman pinned under his hands and said, for all of us to hear, in this room you follow my direction. The bailiff edged closer, ready to risk his job. The clerk's eyes were wet and furious. A man in the back row whispered a curse into his fist. A teenage girl clasped her mother's arm so hard the knuckles went white. No one moved. It takes a different kind of courage to interrupt a machine while it's running. Naomi turned her head as far as the pressure let her. She found the judge. She found the ceiling. She found the seal of the court, the balanced scales cast in bronze and shadow. When she spoke, it sounded like a line she'd rehearsed for a different stage and found herself delivering here. I'm here, she said, to tell the truth. Another drop hit the floor. Time hitched. Reynolds pressed down. The veins stood out on his forearm like cords. Cooper swallowed the Adam's apple in his throat, rising and falling like someone had put a stone on it. This is a lawful detention for security, Reynolds declared, making up gravity as he went. The witness is non-compliant. He flexed, and Naomi's fingers opened involuntarily on the wood palm lines flooding with red. The judge's voice hardened. Sergeant Reynolds, you are in violation of this court's order. Release her. He didn't. He leaned closer instead so that when he spoke, his words landed where only she could feel them breathe. You don't get special treatment here. And then he looked up at the room again, just to make sure we saw the lesson. I can still see the exact moment the humiliation became public property. It wasn't the blood, it wasn't the cuffs. It was the way Reynolds used the court itself as a backdrop, like the seal behind Naomi's bowed head was a trophy on his mantle. The room had been built to elevate truth. He turned it into a stage for dominance. Someone finally cried out 2 sharp syllables that might have been stop or might have been a name. It didn't matter which. The sound snapped whatever thin thread of denial was left. We were no longer an audience. We were witnesses to a woman in uniform being broken across a piece of government furniture while a judge stood on her feet and the law pounded the desk, and none of it for the moment changed a thing. Her wrists were already locked in steel when I noticed the blood. It wasn't rushing anymore, just spreading thin, bright lines, tracing across her skin until it pooled against the cuff and seeped downward. And there, right where the cuff met her hand, the face of her smartwatch gleamed. A faint crack in the glass caught the light. Naomi tilted her eyes down subtle, almost like a reflex. But I swear I saw it that moment when pain became calculation. The whole room had gone still, the way a forest does before a storm. The judge's voice hung unanswered in the air. Reynolds leaned heavier, pressing his authority into her shoulders as if he thought force alone could rewrite the law. Cooper looked everywhere except her face. The gallery didn't dare breathe, and then she moved. It wasn't a struggle, not a fight, just a single thumb pressing against the cracked glass of that watch, a gentle, deliberate motion. I didn't know what it meant then, but I knew it mattered. The silence deepened. For me, it was physical, like the air itself had pulled back from the room. No shuffle of papers, no cough, not even the usual hum of lights, just the sound of her breath. And then layered under it the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Thud, thud, thud. I wasn't the only one who heard it, though I knew it was impossible. Sometimes tension makes sound feel shared. Naomi lifted her chin slowly, eyes meeting Reynolds's with an expression that didn't belong to someone being humiliated. There was no panic, no surrender. Only this strange, unsettling calm. Blood at her temple wrists bound, yet her presence filled the chamber in a way that silenced even the judge. And then she spoke. "You have 17 minutes to release me." Not shouted, not pleaded. Spoken like a fact, like the weather. Like the kind of thing you don't argue with because it isn't meant for argument. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe Reynolds had heard the same thing I did, that tone, that gravity, and that he'd step back. But he didn't. He laughed, loud, derisive, bouncing off the walls with a harshness that jarred everyone back into their seats. 17 minutes, he scoffed. "Lady in here, I'm the law, not you." His voice carried brash and certain, but the sound didn't erase what she just planted in the air. That sentence lingered thick and heavy, a countdown nobody could see, but all of us could feel. The crowd shifted nervously. Some whispered. A woman clutched her husband's arm. A man in the back muttered, "What did she just say?" The clerk's eyes flicked from Naomi's watch to the judge, then back, as though trying to assemble a puzzle she'd never been given the picture for. Confusion spread like ripples. People leaned into one another searching for answers, but no one spoke them aloud. The word 17 minutes had taken root. Naomi didn't repeat herself. She didn't explain. She simply sat there, wrists bleeding into steel lips curved in the faintest smile. The kind of smile that makes you wonder if you've just miscalculated everything. Reynolds barked to cover the unease snapping at Cooper. "Get her out of here." But even his bluster felt thinner now, like his voice couldn't quite fill the silence Naomi had created. And me, I couldn't take my eyes off her. Not because she was broken, but because she wasn't. Something in that quiet confidence told me she wasn't bluffing. That watch, that drop of blood, that calm smile, whatever she'd done, it meant something. The judge tried to recover authority. "Lieutenant Carter," she said carefully. "What do you mean by—" But Naomi stayed silent. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at Cooper. Her gaze stayed fixed on Reynolds, steady as stone, like she was waiting to see how long it would take him to realize the ground under his boots was shifting. And the rest of us? Well, we leaned forward in our seats, hearts caught in our throats, desperate to know what exactly happens when those 17 minutes run out. They yanked her up so fast the bench screeched against the floor. Lieutenant Naomi Carter's shoulders jerked, wrists twisted in the cuffs, but she didn't cry out. Reynolds had her by one arm, Cooper by the other, and the sight of those two men dragging a woman in full uniform down the aisle of a courtroom silenced whatever courage the rest of us might have had. The judge shouted, "Release her. That's an order." The gavel cracked sharp as thunder, but Reynolds didn't slow. He shoved the doors open with his shoulder, pulling Naomi into the hallway like she was contraband instead of a soldier. The echo followed us, heels, boots, cuffs, rattling metal against bone. The sound didn't belong in a courthouse. It belonged in a back alley. Reynolds pressed his radio. "Control, this is Reynolds. We're detaining a non-compliant subject resisting inside the courtroom." The words chilled me. He was building the record as he went laying bricks of a lie for anyone who wasn't here to see the truth. Cooper stumbled beside him, his grip hesitant, his face pale. "Blake," he muttered, voice cracking. "Are you sure about this?" She's... Reynolds cut him with a glare. Do you want to keep your badge, Cooper? Then don't question me again. It was like watching a teacher slap a child into silence. Cooper's head dropped. He tightened his hold, though his hand shook. Naomi's steps faltered once. Blood was still working its way from her temple, a red thread painting her cheek and staining the collar of her uniform. She was breathing hard now. Shallow, controlled breaths, the kind you take when pain is threatening to topple you. But her face wasn't broken. Her eyes stayed forward, steady, unflinching, and when they caught mine for the briefest second, I swear I felt my own spine straighten. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even asking. She was enduring. That hallway, God, I'll never forget it. The courthouse walls that had looked so solid when we filed in now felt like they were caving inward. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, cold and merciless. The portraits of old judges stared down, frozen smiles that seemed to mock the living chaos below them. Every door they passed stayed shut, as if justice itself had turned its face away. It felt less like a hall of law and more like a gauntlet, an ugly stretch where truth had no foothold. A clerk ran after them a few steps, stammering, "Sergeant, please, she's a witness." Reynolds didn't even turn his head. He just barked, "Back to your post," and the clerk froze, fear pinning her where authority couldn't. Cooper's voice came again, quieter, almost trembling. "We don't have grounds. She hasn't done anything." Reynolds jerked him close by the collar while still gripping Naomi with his other hand. His whisper was venom, but loud enough for me to catch. "She'll have grounds when I write them. You want to keep arguing, or you want to keep working?" Cooper said nothing after that. His silence was heavier than the cuffs on Naomi's wrists. Naomi stumbled once more as they turned a corner, but even in that stumble there was dignity. Her chin lifted, eyes locked ahead. And I thought then, if this is what it looks like when a person refuses to surrender, maybe dignity isn't polished metals or court orders. Maybe it's just refusing to drop your gaze while the world tries to grind you into the floor. Every person who saw them pass felt the same clash inside the uniform, demanding respect, the blood demanding outrage, and the silence demanding shame. And as the doors at the end of the hall swung open, spilling their figures into the harsh light beyond the courthouse, the supposed temple of justice felt more like a furnace, a place where truth was burned down to ash. That hallway was no longer a corridor of law. It was a tunnel straight into hell, and Naomi Carter walked it with her head held high while two men tried to drag her lower. They had her pointed toward the stairwell down to the basement cells when the building itself seemed to answer her deadline. The door at the end of the corridor blew inward on a gust of heat and daylight. It wasn't dramatic so much as decisive, like the courthouse had exhaled. For a second, Reynolds froze, one hand on Naomi Carter's elbow, the other still crushing his radio. Cooper's grip loosened just enough for Naomi to find her balance. Then the sound rolled in engines, idling low, synchronized the kind of mechanical heartbeat you feel in your ribs. 3 black SUVs slid to a stop across the loading bay doors, opening in a single practiced sequence. 6 people stepped out in plain clothes that didn't read plain at all, dark jackets, clean lines, no badges on their chests, but authority stitched into the way they stood. Feet shoulder-width, hands empty, invisible eyes sweeping the space without hurry. "Who the hell are you?" Reynolds called, squaring his shoulders as if his voice could widen him. No one answered him at first. They didn't need to. The lead man showed his hands, palms up, a peace gesture that somehow said command. He walked into the hall's shadow as if he owned light and shade. Both stopped at the yellow stripe that marks where the public ends and custody begins, and only then spoke. "Special Agent Marcus Daniels," he said, voice flat as a ruler. He held up a leather case federal seal photograph, the kind of ID you don't get at the mall. "Department of Defense." The letters did something to the air. Not magic, gravity. Reynolds snorted like he'd been offered a counterfeit. "This is a county courthouse," he said. "You're out of your lane." Daniels didn't blink. "Lieutenant Naomi Carter is under active protection pursuant to Protocol Delta 7. Each word landed with its own period. "Release her now." There was no courtroom formality to it. "No, Your Honor." "No, please." Just a statement of jurisdiction, clean as a cut. Cooper swallowed hard. I heard it. The small bob of his throat looked like a white flag nobody had taught him how to wave. Reynolds recovered the way men do when their certainty takes a hit. He got louder. She's a non-compliant subject resisting detention, documenting, said the woman to Daniel's right, lifting a compact camera that blinked a red light. Two more agents peeled off, one posting at the stairwell, another at the loading bay doors. A fourth rolled a slim medical kit across the floor, with the back of her knuckles never taking her eyes off Reynolds' hands. Sergeant Reynolds Daniels continued calm. Like habit, you are directed to remove your hands from Lieutenant Carter and produce the key to her restraints. The hallway held still. Even the fluorescent buzz seemed to draw a breath. Or what Reynolds asked, but it came out thinner than he meant. His fingers flexed on Naomi's elbow. He was looking at Daniels, but I could see the math happening in his periphery. 6 in plain clothes, coordinated, not winded, not guessing. A camera rolling. A medic with blue gloves half pulled on. A man at the stairwell who had already judged the distance and decided he could close it if he had to. Naomi's breath lifted and fell measured. Blood had slid along her jawline and dried into a dark comma at the corner of her mouth. She didn't fight. She didn't fold. When Daniel's eyes found hers, she gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod that read like a password, "I'm here. Proceed." 15 minutes, she had said in the spirit when she told him 17. And we were there. I knew it without looking at a clock. Officer Cooper Daniels said, shifting his attention without raising his volume, "Unlock the cuffs." Cooper's eyes flicked to Reynolds, begging for permission that didn't arrive. He hesitated exactly one heartbeat too long. Daniels didn't repeat himself. He just shifted his stance a quarter inch, enough to make room for the medic to step forward, enough to let the camera catch Cooper's face in profile doubt, fear, conscience before it settled into compliance. Cooper reached for his belt. The key came up on its chain, small metal music in the big quiet. His hands shook. He missed the slot once, breathed, tried again. The lock gave with a click that sounded like a verdict. Red grooves cuffed Naomi's wrists. The medic lifted her forearm, gently turned it, assessed. A second agent handed over gauze without being asked. They worked like people who had done this before, not here, not with these men, but with pressure, with adrenaline, with the need to look steady so someone else could borrow steadiness. Reynolds didn't let go of the narrative. "You're interfering with a lawful detention," he said, but the sentence no longer carried weight. It blew past Daniels like a paper bag past a brick wall. "The only interference," Daniels said, "is yours." He tipped his chin toward the camera. "Continuous recording from arrival." Back to Reynolds. "Further contact with Lieutenant Carter will be treated as obstruction and as assault on a U.S. service member under active federal protection." He didn't thunder. He didn't threaten. He labeled. The bailiff had followed us halfway down the corridor without announcing himself, a hand half raised, as if he'd been asking the room for permission to exist. When he saw the cuffs come off, he exhaled so hard it fogged the edge of his glasses. The clerk stood just behind him, clutching a stack of forms, eyes bright with something like relief, trying not to become tears. Reynolds' hand hovered too near his taser. The agent at the stairwell didn't twitch. He simply angled his shoulders, shrinking the distance without seeming to move. The medic murmured to Naomi, "Pressure here, Lieutenant," and Naomi gave a tiny copy that made me think of radios and deserts and nights where the stars are knives. "Lieutenant Carter," Daniels said to her. Now, as if Reynolds had stepped out of the room, "Are you injured beyond what we can address on site?" She wet her lips, tasting copper. "Minor laceration," she said. "No loss of consciousness." Her voice was professional, but her eyelids floated closed for half a second, and in that small dark, she let a tired smile pass over her mouth. "If you blinked, you missed it." I didn't. It wasn't triumph. It was recognition. The moment when a weight you chose to carry meets the hands it was waiting for. "Control," Reynolds barked into his radio, grasping for ground. "Be advised, multiple unknowns in my corridor." "Claiming federal names are not unknown," Daniel said, holding his ID steady so the lens could love it. "They're documented. You are documented. Your statement in the courtroom was documented." He turned a palm toward the medic, who snugged a band of white around Naomi's wrist to cover the angry red where steel had chewed skin. "We're almost done here." Cooper found a place for his hands where they wouldn't betray him, clasped behind his back like a boy reciting a lesson. He looked at Naomi once more, and in that look was an apology he hadn't earned the right to give. Sergeant Daniels said finally, tone unchanged, patience unspent, "You'll step aside." Reynolds' face had lost its color by degrees, not all at once. Up close, certainty leaving looks a lot like altitude sickness. He stared at Naomi as if he could still will the moment back into his shape. But the room had learned a new geometry, and he wasn't the axis anymore. He shifted, not a retreat, not yet, just a step that wasn't forward. Naomi rolled her shoulders, carefully testing the space that had returned to her. The medic dabbed at the dried comma on her mouth. She breathed in and let it out slow. For the first time since the witness rail, her eyes softened, the kind of soft that follows a held-breath deadline arriving on time. I didn't cheer. No one did. It wasn't that kind of rescue. It felt less like a cavalry charge and more like the truth coming back online, humming through the wires we keep pretending are dead. Reynolds looked from Daniels to the camera to the bandage around Naomi's wrist. Something in him registered the shape of the mistake. 17 minutes, he muttered almost to himself, as if the number had finally decided to be real. Naomi's lashes lifted. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She gave a faint, exhausted smile that said what the rest of us were thinking. He had dragged the wrong woman, and the darkness for once had split. They sat her down on a bench outside the courtroom while the agents worked. A medic crouched at her side, rolling gauze across her temple, with hands steady from long practice. The sting of antiseptic drifted into the air, sharp, clean, almost out of place in a hallway that still smelled of fear. Naomi kept still, eyes half closed, the way a soldier does when she knows every unnecessary motion costs strength. And in that half-closed space, you could almost see her slip backward, away from the sting, away from the cuffs, into a memory stitched so deep it rose like muscle. Charleston, 1945. The war had ended, but the battles hadn't. Sergeant Elias Carter, her grandfather, walked through these same streets in a uniform still dusted with Europe's soil. Bronze buttons, polished boots, scuffed from marching longer than most men could imagine. He had fought for a country that never promised to fight for him. And when he came home, it was the courthouse steps that greeted him, not with honor, not with thanks, but with fists. The police had been waiting, not because he had broken a law, but because he had worn one. That uniform, that skin. They shoved him down before the columns beat him, where marble met brick, and left him with a lesson they thought would keep him low. Your dignity isn't welcome here. But Elias never surrendered it. Family stories said he stood again, wiped the blood from his brow with the back of his sleeve, and lifted his head higher than before. And to the boy who would become Naomi's father, and later to Naomi herself, he left a line that was passed down like scripture. Don't you ever let them steal the dignity stitched into this uniform. The words weren't loud. They didn't have to be. They lived in the bloodline, in the marrow. Now, decades later, Naomi sat on that courthouse bench with blood of her own trailing down into white gauze. She could almost hear her grandfather's boots striking the same stone floors, almost feel the echo of his humiliation breathing beside hers. Her lips tightened not from pain, but from recognition. This wasn't just her battle. It was his replayed. It was theirs, every soldier, every family who had ever been told service didn't buy them respect. The medic asked softly, "Lieutenant, does this hurt?" Naomi blinked back into the present, her gaze steady again. No, she answered, though the sting was obvious. What she meant was, something else hurt is nothing compared to dishonor. One of the agents shifted, looking at her with a kind of reverence, usually reserved for higher rank. And I thought then what they were seeing wasn't just an officer bandaged after an ordeal. They were seeing history loop through one body, one uniform refusing to break. The hallway grew quieter, as if even the building was listening. And for those of us who knew pieces of Charleston's past, the weight of it pressed down the memory of Buffalo soldiers parading in dignity, only to be shoved aside. The memory of a black man in uniform beaten under the same seal of justice Naomi had just bled beneath. Her eyes lifted at last, not toward Reynolds, not toward the cuffs that lay discarded on the floor, but toward the seal of the court carved into the wall. She looked at it the way her grandfather must have, knowing it was supposed to mean balance, knowing it had so often tilted the other way. And in that silence, I swear I heard Elias Carter's voice, low, steady, carried across years. Hold your ground, Naomi. Your dignity is older than their power. That was the moment I realized what we were watching wasn't a single woman's humiliation or a single woman's defiance. It was a chapter in a story much larger, much older. Her blood wasn't just hers. It was ink in the long record of a community that had been forced to write its truth in pain and still insist on honor. The older faces in the gallery seemed to understand it too. Some nodded faintly. Some blinked back tears they hadn't expected. It was no longer just Naomi Carter on that bench. It was every soldier who had been told his sacrifice ended at the color of his skin. And as the medic taped the last strip of gauze in place, Naomi drew in a slow breath. When she let it out, it sounded like resolve. Not defiance, not vengeance, resolve. The kind that comes from carrying not just your own fight, but the fight handed down by those who refuse to fall. In that moment, siding bruised and bound, yet unbroken, she became the echo of her grandfather's vow. A vow that had survived fists, decades, and injustice to arrive here in her blood unshaken. And the hallway, heavy with history, seemed to bow to it. They reconvened in the courtroom that same evening, though it no longer felt like the same room. The benches were half filled with people who hadn't left after the chaos, faces still pale whispers, low a collective need to see what would come next. The judge ordered an emergency hearing, her gavel striking not just for order, but for urgency. Boxes appeared, files stacked high, screens rolled into place. What had begun as an arrest gone wrong, it was about to widen into something else entirely. A federal attorney slid a binder across the table. The projector hummed to life, throwing documents against the wall where the seal of the court usually stood alone. Words in black and white pulled from servers and inboxes became a kind of evidence no one could look away from. Exhibit A. The attorney said, voice steady. Traffic stop records from Sergeant Reynolds and Officer Cooper spanning the last 2 years. Rows of names, dates, and outcomes filled the wall. The pattern was impossible to miss. Nearly every driver flagged cited or arrested under their patrol was black. Beside it, a much shorter list, white drivers, same violations released with warnings. Gasps spread through the gallery. A woman pressed her hand over her mouth. A man shook his head like denial alone could rearrange the numbers. Cooper sat hunched, eyes on his knees. Reynolds glared at the projection as if his anger might erase it. And then came the emails. Exhibit B, the attorney announced. The next screen flickered on messages between Chief Daniel Whitmore and his officers. Words like target zones, high-yield stops, quota fulfillment. A specific line glowed larger than the rest. Concentrate patrols in North Charleston. Minority arrest ratios will boost our funding request. The room erupted not in shouts, but in that soundless recoil when everyone realizes they've been breathing poison without knowing it. Whitmore sat at the defense table, silver hair combed back, posture crisp, as if discipline could hide decay. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at Naomi. She rose slowly, still bandaged, uniform torn, but presence unbroken. Her voice was low enough that people had to lean forward, but clear enough to strike through every whisper. You didn't just betray the people you swore to protect, she said. You betrayed the very idea of justice. You turned this courthouse into a marketplace, selling dignity for dollars. Her words didn't shout. They carried heavy and deliberate, like stones laid one by one across a river. Whitmore finally spoke, his tone smooth, almost rehearsed. Lieutenant Carter, he said, you're a soldier. Brave, decorated, no doubt, but you're naive. Systems don't bend for outrage. Systems endure because they have to. One soldier doesn't change that. The sentence slithered through the chamber. People shifted, some nodding unconsciously, others bristling. It was the kind of cynicism that wears the mask of wisdom. Naomi didn't flinch. My grandfather wore this uniform and was beaten on these steps. You ordered men to repeat that history. Tell me, Chief, how many generations do you think it takes before someone refuses to bow? Her eyes never left his. The lights above caught the bandage on her temple, stark against her dark skin, a visible reminder of the price already paid. The gallery froze between breaths. You could feel the collision of philosophies not shouted, but sharpened. One man insisting corruption is inevitable. One woman insisting dignity is not negotiable. The judge leaned back, her face unreadable, gavel resting but not forgotten. The documents glowed on the wall behind her like an indictment carved into stone. And for the first time, the room seemed to understand this wasn't Reynolds against Naomi, or even Whitmore against one soldier. It was the system itself on trial. The silence stretched brittle, electric. And in that silence, you could feel every person asking themselves the same question: if she stands against that machine, who among us will stand with her? It didn't take long for the pushback to begin. The truth never comes cheap in Charleston, and you could feel the price climbing by the hour. First, it was the student, the one who'd had the courage, or maybe just the reflex to lift his phone when Reynolds shoved Naomi against the rail. He'd uploaded a clip before the bailiff swept everyone out. By evening, 2 cruisers idled outside his apartment building, engines humming all night long, headlights brushing his windows like accusations. He posted once more, voice tight with fear. "They're watching me." Then silence. Next came the older couple. They tried to intervene in the hallway, tried to speak up for Naomi when she was dragged away. 2 days later, they each had citations stacked against them: cracked taillight, improper turn, failure to yield. Petty tickets, but they came like lashes reminders of who held the whip. The message was clear: speak up and you'll pay. And then the email arrived. I heard about it only after Naomi handed it to the agents, but I can still imagine the chill of it appearing on her personal account. Not military, not official, just a plain, ugly message from Reynolds himself. "Meet me privately. We can resolve this between us. You don't want to push this further." Resolve. The word stank of threat dressed as mercy. Naomi didn't hesitate. She didn't delete it. She didn't respond. She flagged it, printed it, and walked it straight to the FBI liaison already stationed in the courthouse. She placed the paper down like evidence, her bandaged temple proof that some fights aren't fought in whispers. Her voice was even when she said it. "This goes on record." The agent nodded, and that's when the floor shifted again. Because right there, as the judge tried to wrangle order and the gallery pressed forward for air, a new feed appeared on the projection screen. No one had cued it. No one had asked for it. A dark background, white text, and a single signature of the Sentinel. The room leaned forward, one file open, then another. Case numbers, arrest logs, internal memos. A chain of falsified reports stretching back years. "Unauthorized transmission," the clerk whispered, but no one stopped it, because every document that bloomed on that wall carried the weight of betrayal. Hundreds of stops, hundreds of names, black drivers, immigrants, poor families, each processed through a machine designed to grind them into statistics. Evidence planted, charges padded, reports copied and pasted, signatures altered. And laced through it all, correspondence from the police union promising coverage and support should any officer face scrutiny. The gallery erupted not with noise, but with disbelief so thick you could feel it press against your skin. People turned to each other, eyes wide, lips forming the same word. "All of it." Daniel stepped forward, voice steady over the chaos. "This is not random," he said. "This is the surveillance archive my team has been compiling under federal authorization. Sentinel is a security measure we created to ensure no soldier, no citizen would face abuse without record." He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. The simple announcement cracked the room open wider than shouting ever could. I watched Naomi then. She stood still, hands loose at her sides, gaze fixed on the screen. She wasn't surprised. Not exactly. More like someone watching a storm she'd been smelling for years finally break across the horizon. The bandage at her temple caught the light, stark against her skin, and for a moment it looked like she was wearing history itself, past and present, bleeding into one. Reynolds tried to bluster, shouting about doctored evidence, but the words sounded hollow against the sheer volume of files. Cooper couldn't even lift his head. And Whitmore, stone-faced at the defense table, sat perfectly still. Because sometimes stillness is all a man has left when the walls close in. What hit me hardest wasn't the scale of corruption. It was the realization that Naomi's arrest had only been one line in a ledger already bloated with lives. She was visible because of her rank, her uniform. But the others, the student, the couple, the dozens, the hundreds, had no protocol, no SUV cavalry, no Daniels waiting at the door. And that was when the gallery understood this wasn't about one woman in a courtroom anymore. This was about a city, a department, a system. The air snapped with it. People shifted eyes, no longer frightened, but furious. And I felt my own breath shake because I knew when truth finally shows its teeth, it never bites just once. I felt the weight in the room shift before I saw why. The side doors opened and a federal prosecutor stepped through, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals in dark suits. He didn't ask permission. He brought it with him. He set a thick folder on counsel table, squared his shoulders to the bench, and spoke in a voice meant for ending arguments. "On behalf of the United States Department of Justice, effective immediately, we are initiating a full pattern and practice investigation into the Charleston Police Department. This court is requested to preserve all records and recordings. No exceptions." The words struck like stones, then spread through the gallery in ripples. People inhaled at the same time. The judge, who had held steady it all day, leaned forward a fraction, gavel resting in her fingers like a metronome waiting for a beat. Reynolds tried to catch the old rhythm. "This is a county matter," he snapped, finding volume where authority had begun to slip. "You don't have jurisdiction in my courtroom." "Not anymore," the prosecutor said, no heat, just a fact. He nodded once to the marshals. They crossed the space with the calm tempo of men used to gathering storms. One took Reynolds' wrist, the other touched his shoulder, and whatever fight he'd been rehearsing drained from him. The cuffs closed with the same crisp click we'd heard hours earlier, only now the sound felt like the room correcting itself. A few hands clapped before people caught themselves. Then more joined in, not wild or vengeful, just relief, finding a voice at last. Cooper didn't wait to be told. He turned his hands behind his back, eyes on the floor. When the steel met his skin, he exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath since morning. If he said "I'm sorry," it was inside his mouth where only he could hear it. Naomi stood near the rail bandage, bright against her temple, watching without a smile. She didn't savor it, she witnessed it. The rail that had bruised her now stood between her and a different kind of power, and she let the moment pass over her like a tide. Then the prosecutor faced the table where Chief Daniel Whitmore sat with his jaw set and his papers perfectly aligned. "Chief Whitmore," he said, "you are summoned for immediate federal questioning and production of communications pursuant to this investigation." Whitmore reached for procedure the way a drowning man reaches for anything that floats. "We will address this through counsel," he began, voice even. "This is irregular. Your compliance is required now," the prosecutor replied. "A grand jury has been noticed. You will be escorted to a secure interview room following this session." A small tremor touched Whitmore's pen. He looked at the screen, still frozen with the union emails, then at the gallery, then finally at Naomi. Their eyes held for a beat. She offered nothing. No triumph, no anger, just that steady, exhausted certainty that had carried her through every hour. He blinked first. The judge brought the gavel down once, not to silence, but to anchor. "This court acknowledges the Department of Justice's notice. Clerk, you will secure the chain of custody for all exhibits and recordings. Bailiff, coordinate with the marshals." Her voice softened on the last sentence. "Let the record reflect the gravity of today." Someone behind me began to cry, the quiet kind that doesn't ask for attention. A woman pressed her hand to her chest. A man bowed his head. Near the aisle, an older veteran in a faded ball cap lifted two fingers in a small salute. He probably knew it wasn't regulation here, but it was what he had. The gesture found Naomi, and she dipped her chin once in return. Reynolds turned his face toward the gallery as the marshals guided him away, as if he still needed an audience to exist. There was no echo left for him to fill. Cooper followed. Shoulders rounded the chain between his wrists, whispering a rhythm that no longer belonged to him. It should have felt like triumph. In a way, it did. The same room that had been twisted into a stage for humiliation was now the scene of accountability. The seal above the bench bronze scales that had looked ornamental all afternoon suddenly seemed heavier, as if they'd been put back to work. The prosecutor gathered his folder. "Judge," he said, "our team will serve preservation notices on the city and the union by nightfall." He nodded toward the projection. "The Sentinel archive will be mirrored to federal storage immediately." The judge answered with a single firm, "So ordered." I looked at Naomi. She stood straighter than she had since the cuffs came off, not taller, just more present. The bandage, the torn collar, the dark line the blood had left on her jaw, none of it had receded. It didn't need to. That evidence would travel with her longer than any exhibit sticker. Around us, people rose in pockets, some to clap, some to wipe tears, some simply to breathe without flinching. It wasn't noisy. It was human. After the applause ebbed, a hush settled that felt different than the silence from earlier. This one wasn't fear. It was attention. The judge spoke again, voice low. "This court was made for truth. Today it remembered." That line stayed with me. It still does. Because in that hour, the room felt level for the first time. The law had turned inward and done its job. Reynolds and Cooper left in cuffs. Whitmore's color had drained to paper. The gallery, so recently a witness to cruelty, became a witness to course correction. And Lieutenant Naomi Carter, blood-dried, dignity intact, stood at the center of it without asking for more than what the oath on the wall already promised. Yet even as relief rolled through the room, a shadow lingered. The files on the screen had listed names that would never stand where she stood. never have a protocol, never hear the marshal's shoes on the floor for them. Justice had found its footing in this place on this day. But beyond the doors, there was still a long ledger to balance, and the cost of finishing that work had not yet been paid. That's how the gavel fell at the end clean. Final and somehow unfinished, leaving us steady enough to walk out and sober enough to ask what came next. The weeks that followed felt like a storm rolling backward, sweeping debris into the open instead of scattering it further. For once, light didn't feel temporary. The Justice Department issued a directive with Naomi Carter's name stitched into it. The Washington Protocols. They weren't just rules for military personnel anymore. They became a safeguard for citizens as well, a system designed to prevent exactly what had happened inside that courtroom, the abuse of power in places built to protect it. Reporters wrote about it like a revolution. Veterans groups called it overdue. And in quiet corners, people whispered the name Naomi with a reverence that didn't belong to medals or ranks, but to survival made visible. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, just her name written in a careful, untrained hand. Inside was a note from Officer Cooper's wife. "Thank you for forcing my husband to see what he refused to see before. Our children will grow up in a better world because of what you endured." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was something more fragile and maybe more powerful acknowledgement that change had cracked open a door in a household that once thought the system untouchable. Naomi kept that note folded into her journal, the edges softening with time. Months later, her own career shifted. She pinned on new bars, Captain Carter now, and with them, a new mandate. She was asked to lead the Military Personnel Protection Initiative, an expansion of Delta 7. This wasn't just a button on a watch anymore. It became an entire framework: rapid response teams, documentation channels, oversight committees. A net wide enough they hoped to catch those who would otherwise slip unseen into silence. 1 year to the day after the trial, Naomi returned to the courthouse. Not for testimony, not for litigation, just to stand in the place where blood had dried on her collar and dignity had stood taller than law. The hall was quieter than she remembered. The fluorescent lights still buzzed the portraits of judges, still hung stiff on the walls, but the ghost had shifted. She paused at the witness rail, fingertips brushing the scarred wood. That's when an old man approached a veteran, his gait unsteady, his jacket lined with pins that had seen too many wars. He held out his hand. His voice cracked as he said, "Thank you, Captain. You carried forward the fight we couldn't finish." Naomi took his hand with both of hers. Her answer was soft, almost private, but it carried in the still room. "The fight isn't over, but at least today we won a battle." She released him gently, then pulled a folded sheet from her pocket. It was a copy of the Sentinel database, a list of names, rows upon rows of men and women whose stories would never make headlines. She studied it for a long moment, her shoulders rising and falling with a breath that was equal parts strength and sorrow. The victory had been real, but so was the cout. She turned back toward the doors, pausing just once more before stepping out into the Charleston air. The sunlight was sharp, insistent. She let it warm her face and spoke words meant for no microphone, no audience, maybe not even for herself, just the truth she carried forward. Sometimes it takes one call to rattle a whole system. But real change, real justice demands we keep fighting long after the first call ends. That was how her story closed that day, not with fireworks or speeches, but with a vow carved into silence. And for those of us who watched, especially the older ones, whose eyes had seen promises broken before the feeling lingered long after we left the courthouse, justice had shown its face fragile and fierce all at once, and we knew it could vanish if left unattended. The applause from that year-old verdict was gone, but its echo remained deep in the ribs, heavy in the chest. A reminder that dignity is not given, it's defended. And Captain Naomi Carter had become its defender, not just for herself, but for all of us. And that's where this journey leaves us, with a reminder that dignity, justice, and truth are never handed out freely. They're fought for, protected, and carried forward, sometimes by just one act of courage. Naomi's story isn't only about her, it's about all of us and the power we hold when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful stories like this one. Your support means more than numbers. It's what gives our team the strength and passion to keep creating meaningful content that truly connects. At Mr. Mac Stories, we believe every story is a spark. Together, we can turn those sparks into a light that lasts